Imagine stepping into an estate agent's window in 1965. The smell of fresh ink on typed property cards, the sound of a typewriter clacking in the back office, and there, pinned to a corkboard, a three-bedroom semi-detached house in suburban London for £2,950. Not $295,000, $2,950. You read that number again, certain there's been a mistake, but there hasn't been. This was the reality of the British property market 60 years ago, a world so different from today's that it barely seems real. Today we're going to walk through the looking glass into 1965 Britain, where buying a house wasn't the impossible dream it's become, where ordinary working families could afford their own front door, and where the numbers were so modest they'd make a modern house hunter weep with longing. Number 20. The average house price across Britain in 1965 stood at £3,650. Let that sink in for a moment. £3,650 for an entire house. Not a deposit, not a year's mortgage payments, the full purchase price. You could walk into a building society office on your local high street, sit down across a wooden desk from a man in a three-piece suit, and discuss borrowing this sum with a seriousness that today seems almost quaint. The forms were filled out in triplicate using carbon paper, each copy a ghostly blue impression of the one above. There were no computer checks, no instant credit scores flashing up on screens. Instead, there was a handshake, a signature, and a promise. The building society manager knew your father, perhaps even your grandfather. Trust was personal, not algorithmic. Today, that same average house costs over £280,000. That's not inflation. That's a fundamental transformation in what it means to own a home in Britain. The dream hasn't just gotten more expensive. It's become, for many, completely unreachable. Number 19. In London's East End, in areas like Stepney or Bethnal Green, you could buy a Victorian terrace house for under £2,000. These were solid brick houses, often with 3 bedrooms, a small yard out back, and memories soaked into every floorboard. Yes, they needed work. Many still had outside toilets, no central heating, and windows that rattled in the wind. But they were yours. A docker or a factory worker, earning perhaps £15 a week, could scrape together the deposit, take out a mortgage, and own a piece of London. The streets were still cobbled in places, children played hopscotch on the pavement, and neighbors knew each other by name. There was a sense of community that came from generations living in the same streets in houses that working people could actually afford. Walk through Stepney today and try to find a Victorian terrace for under £2,000. You won't. You'll find million-pound renovations, coffee shops charging £4 for a flat white, and a generation priced out of the neighborhoods their grandparents called home. Number 18. A brand-new semi-detached house in a developing suburb could be purchased for around £4,000. These were the houses that defined the 1960s British dream: clean lines, modern amenities, a patch of lawn front and back, and that distinctly optimistic feeling of newness. Developers were building estates across the country, transforming farmland into neat rows of homes with names like Meadow View or Green Acres. The houses came with fitted kitchens, indoor bathrooms with colored suites, perhaps in avocado or coral pink, and the revolutionary luxury of central heating. You'd move in with your young family, hang curtains in the bay windows, plant roses in the front garden, and feel like you'd arrived. The mortgage payments were manageable, around £20 a month, leaving enough for the weekly shop, a family holiday to Margate, and maybe even a television set on hire purchase. Today, a new build semi-detached in any decent suburb will set you back at least £300,000. The deposit alone would have bought 7 entire houses in 1965. The dream hasn't just moved. It's been lifted up and placed on a shelf most people can't reach. Number 17. The average weekly wage in 1965 was around £18. This is the number that makes all the others make sense. When you earned £18 a week, a house costing £3,600 was expensive, certainly, but it was achievable. It was roughly 4 times your annual salary, which meant that with discipline, with saving, with a modest deposit cobbled together from family gifts or years of putting pennies aside, you could do it. You could buy a house. The arithmetic was simple, and crucially, it worked. Banks and building societies would typically lend you 2.5 times your annual income, and that was enough. You didn't need to be wealthy. You didn't need inheritance money or help from parents who were themselves property millionaires. You just needed to work, to save, and to wait your turn. Today, with average wages around £30,000 and average house prices over $280,000, you're looking at nearly 10 times salary. The maths has broken. The system that allowed ordinary people to own their homes has fractured, and an entire generation is paying the price. Number 16. A mortgage in 1965 typically had an interest rate between 6 and 7%. This sounds high to modern ears, accustomed to the historically low rates of recent years, but the crucial difference was the size of the debt. 7% on a £3,000 mortgage meant monthly payments that, while significant, didn't consume your entire income. You could still live. You could still eat well, go to the pub on Friday night, save a bit for a rainy day. The mortgage was a part of life, not the totality of it. Building societies were mutual organizations owned by their members, not profit-driven corporations answerable to shareholders. There was a sense that they were there to help you buy a house, not to extract maximum profit from your desperation. The manager who approved your mortgage lived in your town, drank in your pub, understood the reality of your life. Today, mortgages are sold by call centers and algorithms. The interest rate might be lower, but the debt is so monstrous that even at 3%, the payments can be crippling. A lower rate on an impossible sum is still impossible. Number 15. In the industrial north, in cities like Manchester, Leeds, or Newcastle, terraced houses could be bought for under £1,000. This wasn't poverty housing, though it was certainly working class. These were the back-to-backs and through terraces where generations of mill workers, miners, and factory hands had lived, worked, and raised their families. The houses were small, often with just 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a parlor that was kept for special occasions. Coal fires heated the rooms, condensation ran down single-glazed windows on winter mornings, and you shared a tin bath in front of the fire on Saturday nights. But they were solid, they were home. And for £900, less than a year's wages, they were yours. Young couples just starting out could afford to buy rather than rent. The mortgage payment was less than what you'd pay a private landlord. Today, those same terraced houses, if they haven't been demolished and replaced with luxury flats, sell for upwards of £200,000. The industrial jobs that made those communities are gone, replaced by service sector work that pays less in real terms. The houses remain, but they're no longer affordable to the people whose grandparents built them. Number 14. A deposit on a house typically needed to be 10% of the purchase price. On a £3,600 house, that meant saving £360. For a young man earning £18 a week, that was 20 weeks of his entire gross salary. In reality, after tax and living expenses, it might take 2 or 3 years to save that deposit. But it was possible. You lived with your parents, you cycled to work instead of taking the bus, you didn't go to the pictures every week, you made sacrifices. But at the end of those 3 years, you had your deposit. You had your ticket to independence, to marriage, to starting a family in your own home. Parents often helped, sometimes with a gift, sometimes with a small loan that was repaid over family Sunday dinners for years to come. But the sums were manageable. £360 was a lot of money, but it wasn't an impossible fantasy. Today, A 10% deposit on a £280,000 house is £28,000. That's more than a year's gross salary for the average worker. After tax and living expenses, particularly if you're paying London rents, it could take 10, 15, even 20 years to save. The gap between aspiration and reality has become a chasm. Number 13. In Scotland, particularly in Glasgow or Edinburgh, tenement flats could be purchased for as little as £600. These were the distinctive Scottish tenements, solid sandstone buildings with their shared closes and communal stairs. Each flat might have 2 or 3 rooms, high ceilings with ornate cornicing and sash windows that looked out over the street. They weren't grand, but they had a dignity to them, a sense of permanence. The clothes would be swept weekly by the residents on a rota, everyone taking their turn. You'd know your neighbors intimately, hearing their footsteps on the stairs, their voices through the walls. Privacy was limited, but community was strong. For £600, less than what many people today spend on a holiday, you could own a piece of Scottish history, a flat that had stood for a century and would stand for another. Today, those same tenement flats, especially if they've been renovated with modern kitchens and bathrooms, sell for £200,000 or more. Glasgow has been discovered by investors and young professionals priced out of London. The flats that housed working-class Glaswegians for generations are now beyond the reach of their grandchildren. Number 12. Estate agents in 1965 charged around 1% commission, and many sales happened without agents at all. The property market was a simpler, more intimate affair. You'd see a for sale sign in someone's front garden, knock on the door, and have a cup of tea while discussing terms. The owner would show you around personally, pointing out the new wallpaper in the back bedroom, the roses they'd planted just that spring, apologizing for the bit of damp in the corner that just needed a touch of paint. Solicitors handled the legal work for modest fees, often £50 or £60, for the entire conveyancing process. There were no lengthy chains of buyers and sellers, no gazumping, no sealed bids. If you agreed on a price over that cup of tea, you shook hands, and the deal was done. A man's word meant something. Today, estate agents take 1 to 3%, but on modern house prices, that means fees of thousands, even tens of thousands of pounds. The process is adversarial, complicated, shot through with mistrust. Solicitors charge hundreds just for initial searches. The human element has been processed out, replaced by forms, fees, and the constant anxiety that it might all fall through at the last moment. Number 11. In rural areas, particularly in Wales or the West Country, stone cottages could be bought for under £1,000. These were often old farm workers' cottages, built 200 or 300 years earlier from local stone, with thick walls and low ceilings. They had no electricity when first built, and in 1965, many still had limited heating and outdoor facilities. But they came with half an acre of land, views over fields that hadn't changed in centuries, and a peace that city dwellers could only dream of. Young couples, particularly those willing to do renovation work themselves, could buy these cottages for a song. You'd spend your weekends and evenings plastering walls, installing a bathroom, fitting a proper kitchen. It was hard work, but it was your work on your property. The locals in the village pub might have thought you were mad, city folk moving to the country, but they'd help you nevertheless, showing you which builder was reliable, where to get second-hand fixtures, how to coax the temperamental boiler into life. Today, those same cottages, now fully renovated with agas and exposed beams featured in Country Living magazine, sell for £400,000 or more. They're second homes for wealthy Londoners, standing empty most of the year, while local young people can't afford to stay in the villages where they grew up. Number 10. A newly built 4-bedroom detached house in a desirable home county's location cost around £6,000. This was the aspiration purchase, the house that marked you as having made it. These were the houses built for the new middle class, for bank managers and doctors, for businessmen with company cars. They had garages because by 1965 car ownership was becoming normal. They had large gardens, picture windows, and modern conveniences like fitted wardrobes and tiled bathrooms. The estates where they were built had names that evoked the countryside they'd replaced, Oak Close or Willow Drive, and were carefully planned with winding roads and grass verges. Moving into one of these houses was a statement. You'd invite colleagues round for drinks, showing off the split-level living room, the breakfast bar in the kitchen, the view of the garden from the master bedroom. Your children would play in streets that were safe because everyone knew everyone, and you'd settle in for what you assumed would be a lifetime. Today, a 4-bedroom detached house in the home counties, in places like Surrey or Buckinghamshire, will cost you upwards of £700,000, often over £1 million. The dream of the detached house with a garden has become the exclusive preserve of the very wealthy, or those fortunate enough to have bought decades ago. Number 9. Council houses were being built at a rate of over 100,000 per year, and they represented a genuine alternative to buying. This is crucial to understanding the 1965 property market. If you couldn't afford to buy, or didn't want the commitment of a mortgage, there was good quality social housing available. Council houses weren't stigmatized the way social housing is today. They were solid, well-built homes with gardens allocated to families based on need and time spent on the waiting list. My own uncle lived in a council house all his life, raised 4 children there, and kept the garden immaculate. There was no shame in it. It was simply how many working people lived. The rent was affordable, perhaps £4 a week, leaving money for other things, for living. The government saw housing as a social good, not a commodity to be traded for profit. Today, council housing has been decimated by right to buy and chronic underfunding. Waiting lists stretch for years, and social housing is seen as a last resort rather than a genuine choice. The alternative to buying your own home is often expensive private renting, with all its insecurity and lack of control. We've lost something important, something that gave working people options and dignity. Number 8. The mortgage application process typically took 2 to 3 weeks. You'd walk into your local building society, sit down with the manager, and explain your situation. He'd ask about your job, your salary, how long you'd been employed there. He might know your employer, might even have gone to school with him. He'd look at your savings book, stamped with deposits made over months or years, evidence of your ability to manage money. He'd assess you as a person, not as a data point. If he approved your application, and most were approved if you were in steady employment with a decent deposit, the paperwork would be drawn up, signed, and completed within weeks. There were no lengthy chains, no month-long waiting periods for surveys and searches. Property moved quickly, because the system was designed to facilitate home ownership, not to extract maximum profit from complexity. Today, buying a house can take months. There are mortgage offers that expire before the sale completes, chains that collapse when one buyer pulls out, surveys that find problems requiring renegotiation. The stress is immense, the bureaucracy overwhelming. What was once a straightforward transaction has become an ordeal that leaves buyers exhausted and anxious. Number 7. In coastal towns like Blackpool, Eastbourne, or Scarborough, retirement bungalows could be purchased for under £2,000. These were the dream homes for working people who'd spent their lives in cities, who'd saved every spare penny to retire by the sea. The bungalows were modest, typically 2 bedrooms with a small lounge and kitchen, but they had views of the sea and they represented freedom. No more factory shifts, no more smog, just gentle days walking along the promenade, sitting in deck chairs reading the paper, feeling the sea breeze on your face. You'd sell your larger family home, buy the bungalow outright, and have money left over to live on. The coastal towns welcomed retirees, built communities around them. There were bowls clubs and afternoon tea dances, bingo halls and winter gardens where orchestras still played. Life was slower, gentler, affordable. Today, those same coastal towns have been transformed by second home buyers and holiday lets. Property prices have soared, pushing out the retirees who once made these places their own. A bungalow with a sea view now costs £300,000 or more, and the bowls clubs are closing because there are no longer enough elderly residents to keep them going. Number 6. The average deposit saved took 2 to 3 years of disciplined saving. This is important because it shows that homeownership required sacrifice, but it was achievable sacrifice. Young people lived with their parents longer, contributing to household expenses, but saving the bulk of their wages. They didn't holiday abroad, didn't eat in restaurants regularly, didn't buy new clothes every season. Entertainment was the cinema once a week, perhaps a dance on Saturday night. Courting couples would walk in parks, go for bike rides, sit in each other's front rooms under the watchful eye of parents. It wasn't deprivation. It was simply how things were done. You saved for the big things, the important things, and a house was the most important thing of all. Parents understood this, supported it, welcomed young couples living at home because they remembered doing the same thing themselves. There was a shared understanding of the goal and the path to reach it. Today, young people are told they should give up their coffee and avocado toast to afford a house, as if £3 saved each day could possibly amount to the £28,000 deposit required. The mathematics don't work, but the older generation, who bought houses when they were affordable, often can't see it. Number 5. Property price inflation between 1960 and 1965 averaged around 4% per year. Houses were getting more expensive, certainly, but at a rate that roughly tracked wages and general inflation. The market was relatively stable. You didn't hear stories of people making fortunes by buying and selling houses every few years. Property was somewhere to live, not an investment vehicle or a pension plan. People bought houses and stayed in them for decades, raising their children there, becoming part of the community. The idea that you should constantly trade up, always seeking capital gains, hadn't yet taken hold. This stability meant that planning was possible. You could see yourself in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years' time. You could make decisions based on your life, not on market speculation. Today, property price inflation has been rampant, averaging well over inflation for decades. Entire economic policies are designed to keep house prices rising because so much wealth is now tied up in property. Those who own benefit, watching their houses become their pensions. Those who don't own watch the ladder being pulled up higher and higher out of reach. Number 4. In working-class areas of London like Bermondsey or Camberwell, Victorian terraces with 4 or 5 bedrooms could be bought for £3,000. These were substantial houses, built for large Victorian families, solid and spacious. By 1965, many were a bit tired, needing new windows or a damp course, but they were sound. Young families would buy them, live on the ground floor while renting out rooms upstairs to help with the mortgage. Lodgers were common, a way to make the numbers work. The houses would smell of cooking from multiple kitchens, echo with different lives being lived under one roof. There was a vibrancy to it, a sense of community within each house as well as in the streets outside. The working-class neighborhoods of South London were densely packed with life, with children playing in the streets, with shops on every corner, with pubs where dockers and factory workers would gather after their shifts. Today, those same houses in Bermondsey or Camberwell sell for over £1 million. They've been gentrified, knocked through to create open-plan living spaces fitted with underfloor heating and marble worktops. The working-class communities are gone, replaced by young professionals and families who could never have afforded to live there without help from wealthy parents. Number 3. You could buy a house without a survey, and many people did. The building society might send someone round to do a basic valuation, to check the property was worth what you were paying for it, but the detailed surveys common today weren't the norm. You'd look around the house yourself, checking for obvious problems like damp patches or rotten windows, but mostly you trusted that a house that had stood for decades would continue to stand. There was a pragmatism to it, an acceptance that no house is perfect, that you'd deal with problems as they arose. And houses were simpler then. No complicated wiring for endless appliances, no central heating systems to fail, no double glazing to mist up. The problems were obvious and fixable. A roofer, a plasterer, a handyman, and you could sort most issues yourself or with local tradesmen who charged fair prices. Today, surveys are essential and expensive, often costing hundreds of pounds. They'll find problems with everything from Japanese knotweed to inadequate insulation, from faulty electrics to subsidence risk. Each problem requires a specialist. Each specialist charges a fortune, and the complexity of modern homes means that maintenance is both constant and costly. The simplicity is gone, replaced by anxiety and expense. Number 2, a mortgage could be paid off in 25 years, and most people managed it. Because the house prices were reasonable relative to salaries, because there was steady employment for working people, because the economy was growing, paying off your mortgage was an achievable goal. You'd make your monthly payments, watch the balance decrease, and know that by the time you retired, the house would be yours. Free and clear. No more payments, just your pension and a house you owned outright. This security was transformative. It meant you could face retirement without fear, could help your children get started, could live your later years with dignity. The building society would send you a letter when the mortgage was paid off, congratulating you, returning the deeds. You'd put those deeds in a drawer, safe, evidence of what you'd achieved through decades of work and saving. Today, many mortgages stretch to 35 or 40 years. People in their 30s are taking out loans they won't pay off until they're 70. The idea of owning your house outright before retirement has become a luxury most can't afford. Instead, there's a generation facing old age still paying mortgages or rent, their pensions eaten up by housing costs, the security their parents took for granted, nothing but a memory. Number 1. And finally, perhaps the most painful number of all. The total cost of all the houses being discussed, from the £600 Scottish tenement to the £6,000 home counties detached, wouldn't today buy you a decent garden shed in most of southern England. Think about that for a moment. Everything we've discussed, every house, every mortgage, every dream of home ownership that was within reach of ordinary working people in 1965, all of it, the sum total of all those prices, would barely register as a deposit on a modest flat in London today. This is the reality of what's been lost. It's not just about numbers or inflation or economic theory. It's about the fundamental transformation of what it means to make a life in Britain. In 1965, if you worked hard, saved carefully, and behaved responsibly, you could own a home. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. The path was clear, the goal was visible, and a society was structured to help you reach it. Building societies existed to facilitate home ownership. Councils built houses for working people. The property market served human needs rather than investment portfolios. Today, that world has gone. Houses have become financial instruments, their prices untethered from what people actually earn. Entire generations are locked out of ownership, paying rent that enriches others rather than building equity for themselves. The security that came from owning your home, the dignity of having a place that was truly yours, the ability to put down roots and become part of a community, all of this has been priced out of reach for millions. These weren't just numbers on a property card in an estate agent's window. They were the architecture of a different Britain, a country where ordinary people could aspire to own their homes, where work was rewarded with security, where the future held promise rather than anxiety. The houses of 1965 were modest by modern standards. They didn't have the open-plan kitchens or the ensuite bathrooms we expect today. But they were affordable, and that made all the difference. When you walked down a street in 1965, you walked past houses owned by the people who lived in them. Postmen owned their houses, nurses owned their houses, factory workers and shop assistants and bus drivers owned their houses. There was a democracy to it, a sense that we were all more or less in this together. Today you walk down those same streets and see houses worth more than most people will earn in a lifetime. The distance between aspiration and reality has become unbridgeable for so many. We're told it's progress that house price increases are a sign of a healthy economy. But for those priced out, for those paying half their income in rent, for those watching their children unable to afford homes in the towns where they grew up, it feels less like progress and more like a promise broken. The Britain of 1965 wasn't perfect. There were still slums to be cleared, still families living in overcrowded conditions, still improvements to be made. But the direction was clear, and it was towards a country where everyone could have a decent home. Somewhere along the way, we changed course. We decided that houses were investments before they were homes, that property prices rising was more important than people being housed. And now we live with the consequences. The numbers from 1965 seem like fairy tales now, impossibly low figures from a time that might as well be myth. But they were real, and they built the Britain where many of today's older generations still live, in houses they bought for sums that would now barely cover a month's rent. Those of us who remember those times, or who've heard the stories from parents and grandparents, carry a particular kind of sadness. Not just nostalgia for cheaper houses, but grief for the loss of possibility, for doors that have closed, for a compact between generations that's been broken. When someone says young people today have it easy, that they should just work harder and save more, those of us who remember the numbers from 1965 know the truth. It's not about effort or virtue. It's about mathematics, about the relationship between earnings and prices that once made home ownership possible and now makes it impossibly difficult. The tears these numbers provoke aren't just about money. They're about the loss of security, of dignity, of the ability to build a life on solid foundations. They're about what it means when an entire generation faces a future where they'll never own their homes, where they'll pay rent all their lives, where the stability their parents took for granted is nothing but a distant dream. The Britain of 1965, with its 3,000-pound houses and its building society managers who knew your name, is gone. And while not everything about those times was worth keeping, the possibility of home ownership for ordinary working people was. That we've lost that possibility, that we've built an economy where housing wealth enriches some while excluding others, that we've turned homes into assets rather than places to live, these are failures we'll be reckoning with for generations to come.